I took some paradigmatic cases of someone worshiping God. Moses confronting the burning bush, Solomon and all the priests confronting the cloud that fills the temple, and really striking incidents like this where God seems to be present in a miraculous way, and people very naturally respond in worship, in submission and awe at God's being there, and tried to think about what might they have thought was going on in those cases, what might we think could be going on in such cases, why is worship an appropriate response to it. And the basic philosophical puzzle that you confront when you think about that is, here you have people who believe that God is present everywhere, and they say that, but then they also will say, oh my goodness, God is present here now in a way that God wasn't just a little while ago. Now, what could you mean by that? What could it mean to be more present? How can God be more present than he was a few minutes ago? So, and that just puzzling over that. So C.J. Ducasse was basically the teacher of my teacher. So he was a professor at Brown University for many years. I believe he passed away in the early 70s, somewhere in the 70s, 1970s. And he was the teacher of Roderick Chisholm when Chisholm was an undergrad, and many, many problems that were central to Chisholm's work are right there in Ducasse. Ducasse was worrying about them, and so naturally Chisholm worried about them too. And so Ducasse was, his portrait sort of hung there over the graduate seminar room when I was a graduate student. Ducasse had a view about the nature of the boundaries of physical objects that was quite interesting, and that I thought shed some light on the way in which we might think of God as being present in different ways at different places. One of the things that you don't want to say about God, or at least many of us don't want to say, certainly the people that I'm talking about don't want to say that God is corporeal, that God is a physical object located somewhere, and has a certain shape and so on. No, God is a spirit, and not a body or a thing made out of matter or anything like that. So if God has a special kind of presence, right, in the temple or in or around the burning bush, you don't want to say God is shaped like the inside of the temple, like he's kind of a cube, or God is shaped like a bush, or the flames in the bush. And what Ducasse does is he gives us a theory about boundaries that kind of loosens us up a little bit, and you think of the shape of a thing a little bit differently. So he says the location of a thing is wherever it is immediately having effects, not in virtue of some intermediate thing. So, I might push an object using a stick. I'm not present where the end of the stick is. I'm using something to move that thing. But the places where I cause things directly, Ducasse says, that's where you're located. And then what he points out is it's in principle possible for a thing to have different locations where it can cause different kinds of of effects immediately without any intermediate things or events. And so he imagines that the visual boundary of something could in principle be different from the tactual boundary of something. So the visual boundary of the thing is the location at which it causes light to bounce back. The tactual boundary is the place where it prevents solid objects from moving into it. If those two boundaries were different for an object, it would be weird to try to pick it up, because you'd reach for it, and if its tactual boundaries were smaller than its visual boundaries, you'd think you should be touching it, but it's not there. You have to go a little bit further. Or if the tactual boundaries were bigger than the visual boundaries, you'd reach for it and you'd bump into it before you would expect to. And so Ducasse says, an object can have its visual and tactual boundaries usually come together. They might be right here, but it might have, let's say, a magnetic boundary that's over here, some other place, and moving things. And he was thinking of the magnetic powers of a thing not as a field, but as something that the object does sort of directly. So you have all these different kinds of boundaries, and there's not just the one shape of the object, there's many different shapes that it has. So applying this to the case of God, God has some kinds of effects that are happening everywhere all the time. So everything is being sustained by God all the time. That's one kind of effect that God has. In virtue of that, God is everywhere, and there is no boundary to God. But there might be special kinds of effects that God brings about directly in just some places, and then those places are then a kind of special location of God. God's located there in a different way than in other places. And I thought this helps us think about the different ways that God might be present in different places, and kind of lays to rest some of the worries that you might have about this turning God into an object that has just a special shape, or God has shrunk somehow. And one thing I talked about was the doctrine of Zimmerman, which is typically described as God having to withdraw from filling every place so that there's room to create something. And that's always bothered people, because it seems to give God a corporeal shape with a hole inside of it. And so one of the nice payoffs of the Ducasse story about boundaries is God can withdraw from a place in some way to make room for things, while not really withdrawing from it, and in fact still filling up everything. So that was one of the applications I developed.